Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon.
This conversation with Nathan Fetherston is, like so many of my conversations, somewhat about me. But in this case, I am his client. He is designing and doing the artwork for everything from our book cover for On Practice as a Way of Being to providing me with a more consistent and hopefully compelling image on social media, so that when people flash by and scrolling their LinkedIn account, they'll see me and they'll see about the podcast that I am representing in that particular post, and also we'll see the links to the book. So I'm learning a lot about how to have a presence in social media. And I can tell you, at my age, nearly 80, I could never have imagined, and I have a pretty wild imagination, 30 years ago, that there would be such a thing as social media and that I would be investing time and treasure in becoming more known through social media, so that I could attract people to particularly to my book, but also to honor by listening to the over 100 people that I have so far, and now added Nathan to the podcast. So here is Nathan Fetherston, Fetherston Design. Well, folks, I'm talking with Nathan Fetherston, and he is the sole proprietor of, guess what, featherstondesign.com. And I know the design part very well now as a direct consumer of his service and his attention. And that's why I'm having this podcast, in part because, first, I'm always interested in people who are relatively early in their careers and practices, and as is Nathan. At least I'm judging Nathan because you're wearing what would you call that cap?
Yes,
a beanie. There you go. And I think
they say toque.
I've been learning that the beanie means something. Why don't we start with that? What is the? I know it looks very comfortable.
What is the beanie?
Yeah.
Well, it's mainly it's for comfort. So I'm from Wisconsin, right?
Uh-huh.
So dressing warm is just part of the culture up here. And beanies are pretty much like, they're not the warmest you can get. You can get a bit warmer, which are ones that have like the ear flaps that go down, kind of like cartoonish Christmas story style. That looks kind of weird though. So I think most people my age who want the beanies gravitate towards it. Also, as somebody who's kind of losing hair, it's always good to use to cover that up. But so the winters are always nice. Summers are a bit tougher because of that. But,
I've only known you in the fall, fall, so I haven't really seen you without your hat, and I don't need you to uncover at this moment for our podcast.
We'll save that. We'll save it.
I do find, in at least my travels running through Facebook and LinkedIn, particularly Facebook, I see quite a people who are younger who do wear the beanies, and they're really essentially a wool cap, wool-like cap. And
did they not have those when you were younger?
Oh no. Well, we wore them when it was cold, but we didn't wear them as a thing.
Okay, so indoors, you'd never
as an indoor thing. No, in fact, take your hat off. This was the second thing that my parents would say when I walked through the door. Welcome, and take your hat off. Design is in your DNA? That's a question. Where does that design impulse root?
It's interesting because the design part was later on. So like art is in my DNA, right? I've been drawing since longer than I can remember, really. Since I was like 2 or 3, I've been just scribbling stuff. And then I actually learned how to draw things like rocket ships and stuff when I was 4. And then I would just fell in love with it, and I would draw every day. And so it was around like when I went to high school, like 8th grade or freshman year, where I was deciding that I wanted to do this as a career, right? Because it made me happy. And I thought like it would be dumb of me not to try to make a career in something that I was good at and that made me happy. I felt lucky that I found that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And design was a way for me to easily commercialize that.
Yeah.
Whereas with art, it's a lot harder for a young artist to make like headway in the art community. It's a lot, and like also like make a living while doing that. It's a lot easier for a graphic designer to, on one hand, be very creative and like be able to feed that desire, but on the other hand, being able to just eat and have a roof over your head and not have to worry about where the next check is coming from. It was more of an adult-oriented decision for me to be able to take my creativity and then use it as a platform for my life.
Yeah. And now, since I climbed up on the platform as a client, what Nathan has been doing for me, folks, is taking my originally very amateur ways of being seen on LinkedIn and Facebook and now Instagram, amateur but heartfelt. And then when the book on Practice as a Way of Being was ready to go, the feedback I got was, you really ought to dress up that, you're a thought leader now, Dave. Make it look like you are in social media. And I thought, well, that's not a bad idea at all. And you were helping and are helping my publisher, My Library, and also Nexus for Change. And of course, you were well recommended. Mm-hmm. So let's take a moment and look at what I looked like before you started helping me in regard, as I just claimed that I was very amateurish. What are the kind of things that you can remember seeing that you needed to get at right away?
Well, I mean, the first thing I did was the book cover, right?
That's right. You designed that.
So before I did the social media stuff, the first Peter Vail related things that I took a look at were the covers from other books. Mm-hmm. Which I had to kind of emulate to make the On Practice cover. Mm-hmm. So those I liked. They were good design, just a bit dated in terms of style, which makes sense because they came out a little while ago, right? Mm-hmm. But generally, I think the design rules were there and all pretty good. When I took a look at the social media, the main issue, which I assume is probably the same issue for most like amateur, non-design oriented people who have a lot of different social media accounts, is the cohesiveness of the brand, right?
Right.
Making sure that people understand that all of these things are kind of interrelated, and understanding that like your profile picture, your banner, right? Like the big long profile image that you have at the very top of your profile page, that can be used as that's valuable real estate that you can use like to advertise or send a message out, and that you can use art and design to communicate that message. And so, for instance, the way that we use color is very important.
Yeah.
The brand color is super important because people, they might not know it, but they have a very fine-tuned understanding of color. And so being able to see these multiple different platforms having the same kind of color scheme with it immediately ties them together, like subconsciously. And so people can, even if they're, say, scrolling through a bunch of different profile pages, right? If they're saying,
which like, people do, if they're going to scroll, they just whip through.
They can, and then their eye will see that same yellow next to that same purple or that same red, and say, "Hey, I haven't seen this before. I noticed that."
That's my happy yellow, my happy yellow.
Yeah, it was actually taking that yellow was kind of like the yellow of, like the ruled yellow pads of paper.
Yeah,
it's a bit old school.
Yeah,
that always just made me, when I was thinking about practice before I really had read the book, which I'm not one of the few to have completed the whole book, but before I had even read into it, I had thought about like writing practice and how when you practice with writing, there are all these ruled lines that you have to kind of pay attention to and stuff. And so that was where that original yellow color kind of came into mind. And then
wow. I never knew that. And I think it makes total sense. So you really looked at it more than a guy who's saying, well, why don't I suggest this book cover be pink or red or whatever. You got deep into your artistic and design DNA, and you said, this is sort of like those old lined pads that people probably in both Peter and David's generation did a lot of writing. And I suspect that probably Peter wrote even this book initially on those pads. So you were channeling that experience. And so that's a start. And so the continuity, back to your point, is once, we've got the sort of the steady color that plays off the book cover and so forth. You wrote that across each of the things you designed. What else did you put in to that color then that said Dave Fearon, Peter Vale?
Into
our heading. So whatever I've got to learn how to banners. Is that it? Whatever is at the
sure,
top.
Yeah. Banner is the word that I use, which I think only technically like Facebook and LinkedIn use. But that's when I see that in my mind, that's like, oh, banner right there. There's the big rectangular one. And well, usually I wanted to make it point to this podcast, right? Like there were essentially like advertising that the podcast exists, and that mainly I thought that was important because that's the thing that's continuing onwards, right?
Right.
The practice book is kind of done. I don't think there might be an addendum of some sort, but
we're adding waffles as we speak. The good thing, I hate to interrupt you there, but the book will never be. I can almost hear Theo Ford-Stiegler groaning when I say the book is alive and will never be done. And Theo's going, oh, because he's the one who has to put these links into the episodes and some articles that Peter wrote and so forth. But the key is, yes, the podcast goes on, and here's why. I love it. I love doing it. I love what we're doing right now. I like the feedback, being a lonely old retired professor. It's wonderful. So yes, I did want to attract more eyes and hold the attention. And that's where a lot of your schooling has come into play. Not only your artwork, but your schooling as you're coaching me and saying, well, this is why we need to have it this way and why you have to say it that way. So go on and tell the folks a bit more of my remedial experience in appearing in social media. What else did you coach me to do?
Well, there are parts where a lot of the issue, and I think this is an issue with a lot of people your age, right, is resolution, is recognizing that computers can now give very, very quickly render super, super high res images. Like there's no longer like a hardware issue with having big high res images. And two, that people will look at a low res image and will immediately connote that with low quality of like a service.
Wow.
Like if I were looking for, let's say like a flower shop, right?
Yeah.
I want to buy a bouquet of flowers, and I have 3 flower shops within 5 miles of me, and I look at their logos and one of them is low resolution. I'm not going to that flower shop, even though that flower shop might have the best flowers. They might put all of their eggs in a different basket, right?
Wow.
When it comes to me having to sort through all the different flower shops, those are the first that are on the chopping block, because visual information is just so important in social media. That's how you scan everything. And you have to scan because there's so much information. And so it's those with the best, crispest visuals that get looked at first and longest. So mainly it's about like hedging bets, because even if you have like a low res image, someone is going to still look at it. Someone is still going to maybe engage with it, but the numbers will be larger if you have like a really good, crisp image. And you had one, but only on some of your profiles, right? There were some others that had like a low res image that you hadn't updated.
Oh, no. The ones that I cobbled together, with the help of Anthony Rivera, who got me off the ground here, almost 3 years ago, it was a very old picture of Peter and a very, very old picture of me. But we put it together like we were, so we could be in the same artwork each time we posted the podcast. And I think you were one, maybe it was Teo at first, then you who said, you've got to start changing the artwork each time you post these, because it's just it's maybe sending people to someone else's flower shop.
Yeah.
So,
and I think with the different pieces of artwork too, it's also people who already know the podcast. They won't get confused nearly as easily about whether or not they've seen this episode before, or like if they're looking for a specific person. Say you have like you had you have your son on. It's kind of a recurring guest.
Right.
Maybe there are some fans that only like Dave and Dad. I'm only here for Dave and Dad. Screw everybody else, right? It's important then that not only that all of the Dave and Dads look different enough from the others that they can see it, but that the image between all the Dave and Dads are similar enough that you can, tell, oh, that's a Dave and Dad, that's a Dave and Dad, that's a Dave and Dad. When you're, quickly scanning, you're not reading the titles and everything like that.
Right.
And there is a balance still, because you still want to keep all the artwork cohesive and looking pretty similar. You want to keep brand presence there, but you still want to shake it up basically every time a little bit when you post a new podcast.
Yeah. That's great. Now, in regard to the pictures, we finally got a more recent picture of Peter, who's passed away over 2 years ago. And then there was one that was taken of me for a presentation I did on Zoom. And it was done by a professional photographer. So we got those two pictures, and then you put them together. And this is part of the storytelling you're doing. Tell the folks a bit about that, about how you chose to put us on that banner, if you will, and capitalize on those pictures. Yeah.
Well, first, I was immediately drawn to the picture taken by the professional photographer, right?
Yeah.
Because, of course, they put a lot of work into making sure that image was crisp and clean and well-balanced and looked good. And then that was also in black and white, which is similar to how we do things on My Library, is we take images of people, which are usually in color, and then in Photoshop, I make them black and white. And I add color to like their clothes and to the background, but not to the skin tone, because we have kind of like a rainbowish color scheme, and different colors don't really work well when being overlaid in Photoshop on different skin tones. Like darker skin tones won't pick up well with like the purples and the blues. Lighter skin tones will look kind of weird with like the yellows. And so then we wanted to change everything to black and white to make sure that no matter what color we're using, it would always be a crisp, easily readable image. And so to me, that's what black and white means. There's a lot of utility in having a black and white image already. I took that, and then I applied black and white to the Peter image, which didn't have black and white already, and I cut him out. He was, I think in that image, he was sitting. So he was cropped in such a way that both of his shoulders were cut.
Right.
Which meant that I needed to cover that harsh straight line. And so it was natural that I would put Peter in the very, very corner, line up that cropped edge of his shoulder with the edge of the banner image. And then I could put you in front of that other line right there to hide that and make it look like you guys are just standing right next to each other. Oh, and that adds into the story, right? It's a little thing about the story. Like everything communicates, right? Like every image. And the only thing that image really needed to communicate was that this is a team effort between you and Peter. That was the part of the story that I would try to say very briefly with that image, because in general with the marketing, I think the story is what makes the book really special. To me, the story was the thing that made it stand out from even like the CCL, right? Like what is this standing out from other kinds of management philosophy books, I suppose. I'm not sure exactly where we would brand this. It's kind of a philosophy in that there's a lot more it's not like a self-help book necessarily.
Not at all. No, I mean, if you read it, you can help yourself better, but it's not a self-help book. And it is a book that would be very hard for them to, in a Barnes and Noble to classify. Is it a book on leadership? Yes. Is it a book on organization development and design? Yeah. Change, yes, but those are all things that Peter and I worked on over the years. But basically, it is a different kind of book, and it required that kind of creativity you showed in figuring out how to image it and get our story out there in text as well, in very minimal text, but something like that, and then leading readers, potential readers, to the digital book itself. Of course, is part of the goal from wanting me to have a more professional appearance in social media. And if Peter were still alive, he would be very happy with what you've done so far.
Yeah, that's good to hear.
Yeah. So let me jump over to what you volunteered to do as a professional, which is to read our book from the cover you helped design. You designed, to the last conjecture. As a practitioner of your field, as an artist and a designer, was it helpful for you to gain some other insight about yourself as a practitioner by having read that book?
Yeah, and I think so. I had mentioned this to you before, that the book gave words to concepts and ideas and and insights that I had, that I already noticed about my practice. First off, the word practice, right? I didn't really think of it as, I thought of practicing, right? Like the verb. I didn't really think of practice.
Yeah.
I didn't think of applying that to my artistic and design careers. And then there are other words too. The other one that always sticks in my mind is autotelic. Another word that, and words are important to me, I think, in that they allow me to kind of wrap my head around a certain concept. I think I'm very language oriented. That's why I'm good at writing. I think I'm good at design, partly because design is also language. It communicates in a visual way as opposed to a strictly linguistic way.
Yes.
But having a word to kind of have that concept allows me to compartmentalize it, and then I can more easily work that into my daily routine. I can understand it. I can look at it and analyze it. So when I have the names behind those concepts of practice, of whitewater was the other one, the constant whitewater, a way of kind of framing my practice. Those kinds of things I find to be not only really interesting, but I think those will be helpful moving forward. Especially as the more that I get into design, I think the more whitewatery it will be, right? Our clients are going to have to be constantly shifting. The tools change. The trends go by in a flash,
Yeah. And, you're on top of it now, and then tomorrow you're not. I have two thoughts, which I better get out before I forget. First, another one of Peter's conjectures is that practice is perceptual and perceptual and perceptual. It was an interesting word that caught Peter's attention when one of his former students, Eric Dent, as he says in the conjecture, Eric got me to think about this. Practice, in order to practice anything, and certainly acutely in your field, you have to sharpen your perceptions. But to be perceptual is a state of being. It is. I am a very perceptual person, and of course that would what we'd be wanting for a surgeon, for example, or basically anyone, and it is something to be worked on. And there are a lot of other ways. I can say now that what Peter had a vocabulary bigger than bigger than a freight car. But he also was very interested in engaging people first as a teacher when he was my teacher. He could have used big words And sometimes he would select, as would a poet, which he was as well. I want to use this word. It may not be a word you're familiar with, but there's a story behind it, and there's a benefit for you knowing it. Otherwise, he would use common language. And so reading through Peter's writing in particular, did you see those moments where you think, that's a little dense? And then the other hand, he says, but then the next sentence, he makes a light of something, or he puts something personal in there.
Yeah, there definitely are like sections that I would want to read again because they are very dense. Peter doesn't really mince words. I get the impression that every single word, that there's no fat there, right? That the sentence was poured over, and that every word needs to be there, right? You couldn't really change it. But the stuff that I found really, really not dense, the stuff that I found probably the easiest to read and the stuff that I enjoyed reading the most was the stuff that was kind of autobiographical. Because whenever, I would say kind of autobiographical because it wasn't really structured like that, but anytime he would go into one of his many sailing metaphors, where you would go into like a golfing thing, or he would talk about his academic time, his career earlier on. It was in the last few conjectures where he talks a lot about the story of not only like developing the idea of practice, but why he thought that was so important for academia and stuff like that to learn. And so those I found to be really, really not, I mean, maybe they were still dense, but they were a lot easier for me to read without having to like reread a sentence, right? Those are the things that I found probably I found most enjoying when I read.
Good to hear. No, you can imagine here is what you read of Peter's work was pretty much as Peter wrote it. And my promise to his family was that if I take this on, I'm going to be very, very careful to make sure that the people are reading Peter Vale with my augmentation. And my augmentation was not to explain Peter Vale. He could certainly explain himself. It was to show as a fellow learner with Peter what this particular conjecture might mean to others, as it certainly meant to me. So it was an interesting challenge because I did not want to change much of Peter's work. I knew how he did work over every word, and had he had the opportunity to revise, which he wanted to do before he passed away, he might have tweaked it even more, or even said, I don't want to say that anymore, and put something else in there. That's probably why he would love a living book, because he could come back to it in a couple of years and say, well, I don't see this anymore. But anyway, my point is that it was the combination that I think, not only by pictures that you put up there, where in some of the podcasts you can hear Peter and me having a conversation, but also in a way the book is like a conversation. Do you see it that way?
Well, sure, because I think especially with your passages, there are a lot of questions that were asked of the reader. You're pretty much, in every conjecture, the book would stop and ask the reader, like, hey, what in your life does this conjecture apply to, right? What in your life is there something that you would always, in the chapter of the Whitewater, which I just remember because we did quotes for that very recently. I went through that. Talking about like, is there anything in your life that you love so much that you would be with it through thick and thin, right?
Thick and thin, that's right.
Through all of the challenges of Whitewater, like, what would you do where those challenges like excite you as opposed to intimidate you? Or maybe like intimidate you a little bit. There's kind of excitement inside of that intimidation, right? But you know what I mean? Like,
I do. I do. That's a great interpretation of what I think Peter meant and what it felt like. You know, in a way, this getting this book done was definitely a Whitewater run. In that when he and I were looking for a publisher, he was in hospice and very, very much on the edge of his health. And if we'd had a conventional publisher, he probably wouldn't have been around to do anything about it. But I did make a contract with him that I would get it done. And so there it was. And for quite a few months after he passed away, I was like, what am I going to do? And And fortunately, I found innovators in the field of information for the digital world called Steve Cady, Theo Ford Stiegler, and Carol Gorlick, who said, "Well, come on in. And I wrote him a little essay about whitewater, where I took a character from a novel I wrote, Dana Gilbert, and I said, well, what would her life be now? I wrote it in 2006. Here it was 2016 or so. What would her life be now in the middle of this crisis and pandemic? So I resumed my conversation with Dana Gilbert and found out that a lot of things were not going well in her life or her company's life. And they kind of liked that. They liked that I had a different take on conveying messages about, in this case, life in the COVID. And so that encouraged me. And then they saw the manuscript and they knew Peter Vale and they said, let's do it. So weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of work. You read the result.
Yeah, but I want to go back. You wrote a novel?
Yeah, I did.
What was it about?
It was about it was called I should know off the top of my head. I spent my life with it. It's called Inside Knowledge: Rediscovering the Source of Performance Improvement. And as a graphic
novelist.
Yes. And Steve Cavallari, my co-author and my good friend and fellow faculty member at Central Connecticut State, and had done a tremendous amount of thinking and reading and writing about the basis of real-time learning, which we found to be American pragmatism and the work of Charles Peirce. And I thought we'd love to get that message out to people that, we're learning all the time and we can improve the quality of our knowledge if we take more responsible for using our powers to learn. And yet, if you read anything that Peirce had written, or even what we would write as academics, it probably would have been read by 11 people. So I said, I was very active in the quality movement then. And I said, maybe I can get Quality Progress to produce this book as a demonstration of the part about rediscovering the source of performance improvement. And guess what the source was? It was a person called Dana Gilbert, who worked in a call center in a company that was undergoing transformational change of not a good sort, but it was going through change. And Dana was, of course, on the call center and on the telephone back then, and hearing the sounds of her customers, her business customers, grappling with in their version of what was going on in their whitewater. And she provided a very important kind of knowledge, which then was going to be overtaken by the villain in this story, which is information software that would basically be like the automatic order takers and the horribly frustrating voices you get when you call a big company now, and it sounds like a human being, and you're screaming at him and calling him all kinds of rude words. It's just an algorithm. But anyway, as we're going back here, this is about you. Well, it isn't about you. It's about our collaboration, Nathan. And it was my collaboration particularly with Theo, and it was my collaboration with Steve Cavallari, all through my career. I got to be. This goes to your point about being an artist. My art is an ability to tell a huge story called a novel. Never been a novelist, but I did it for this purpose. I wanted people to feel close to the characters who are the real doers in business that make the work. Peter Vale called them the dark matter of business. That people get it done. And so collaboration is important. What has it been like for you in these 2 months of intensive collaboration to collaborate with me?
Well, it's great because you're my guinea pig, right? I'm actually using you for my purposes. So, well, because your collaboration is kind of enveloped within my larger collaboration with Nexus and My Library.
That's right.
Particularly with Steve and Teo. And so we were talking about this idea of how do we brand thought leaders. That thought leaders in general, first off, it's a word that's a bit of a catch-all, but they all kind of do follow similar properties. Mm-hmm. Pretty much all thought leaders are like, this is another thing that appeared in On Practice, lifelong learners. A lot of thought leaders have a lot of these kinds of similar attitudes. And so how do we, and also similar situations in that on one hand, they have an academic practice. On another hand, they're trying to sell a book. On a third hand, they're a father or a grandfather, right? And all of those are happening on social media at different levels. So how do we, from the top view, how do we structure this? How do we say, okay, this is how you market or use your academic resources. This is how you use your non-academic resources. This is the stuff that is private, that is just personal between you and your family, yada, yada. Mm-hmm. And so you were the first of these thought leaders for us to say, well, we just need somebody where we can kind of hit the ground running, because all thought leaders are ultimately going to be different. They're going to have slightly different situations. Before we really are able to understand this at a higher level, I felt like we just needed a thought leader to start branding around. And then all of the nitty gritty and stuff we'll be able to figure out later, but we need a test subject. Mm-hmm. And so you and your situation was a perfect little test subject. And before we got into this idea, I had already worked with you on the cover.
That's right.
So I was already
indirectly. I don't think I ever talked to you directly about it, but you got my messaging.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so I was already kind of familiar with the existence of this. And once Teo had mentioned that you needed some more help with that, that was the perfect opportunity for thought leaders, because before that, Steve Cady was going to be the thought leader whose brand we were going to push out, which to me was something that I was excited to do, but I knew that would take a very long time, partly because Mr. Cady is not Mr. Cady. My goodness, Dr. Cady, sorry, is a very, he doesn't want to be Dr. Cady. We wanted to be Steve Cady, the brand. The brand is Steve Cady.
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
So that's part of the
I'm Dave Fearon, but I used to be Dr. Fearon or Professor Fearon or Doc. Yeah. So, there's all these layers of us, aren't there? And Steve would be and is a brilliant person to present as a thought leader.
But he is a professor currently, so he has a lot of time taken away. He doesn't have nearly as much time on his hands. A lot of times sometimes we'll have to a late meeting or something like that, and it's just like it would go much quicker with somebody who, I don't know, maybe is retired and
desperate. No, I am the perfect guinea pig, because and I was for the book too, is because our book, Peter, and my book, By My Library is the first. There's a textbook or two in there, and certainly some wonderful articles in the Collaborative Change Library. But this is a standalone book, and I wanted to be that kind of guinea. Well, not. I wasn't a guinea pig with Teo. I was, I don't know what the word would be. They were experimenting with my kind of authorship, but also I was experimenting with their kind of publishership and putting a lot on the line, putting Peter Vale's name on the line to do it. And that was a big risk, and it was a risk in a way for people who knew his previous books, because they were made of paper, had covers, and they could stick them on a shelf. And so I had to sell myself and then be sold about how having a book that's on a virtual shelf but always handy, because you can open it on your phone or your pad or your computer, which I felt was important.
And
important change.
And of course, living. the big ever non-ending living document.
Yeah. And I don't like to finish anything. Maybe it's because I'm close to 80.
No, that's the same. That's the artist's way, is that the art, you have to find a place to stop yourself. Like the art is never actually done, in that you always look at it again. You see a little thing you want to change.
Yeah, tweak this.
That's why I love deadlines for art, because it says you stop now. That's your stopping point. It doesn't matter if there's a part you'd want to change, because every piece of art and design I've always made, every single one, I look back in a year and think, oh, I should have done this. I should have done this. Oh. But it's something you just have to get over, right?
Well, in our last couple of minutes for this part of our conversation today, Nathan, because you and I are going to go back and work getting me up to speed, more up to speed on how to carry on a lot of what you started. And we're going to continue in other ways, but I wanted to be able to get to a point where I could illustrate a podcast with a video. There's some clips, I want to do, which says, hey, wait a minute. And posing a question about a conjecture, and you're helping me do that. But in the meantime, what I think is I'm curious about is how this is now changing you. To have done my work working with Nexus for Change in My Library, you said that this is kind of a break away for you to get into this, to be an independent business person. Have you felt some changes in growth in yourself because of taking this risk? Or you left a corporate job, steady paycheck, benefits?
Yeah, I mean, with freelance in general, I'm trying to think that there is a term for like the alienation of your work from the workplace, right? I can't exactly remember the term, but in that, say, if I worked at Target before, right? When I worked at Target, I didn't feel like anybody really needed me. I didn't really feel like I was making much of a difference. I felt like my job could have been done by a robot. Not only could have been done by a robot, could have been done better and cheaper by a robot, right?
Uh-oh. Should I edit that piece out for all the thousands of people who know the same thing you did?
No, I know, but everyone in retail has... No,
I get it. I get it.
Has these feelings, right? And just that, so I didn't feel like my labor was really going anywhere, that I was actually getting any benefit from the labor. Now, even though I work more, I work longer, I work harder. I never had to do a single Zoom call when I worked at Target. I never had to didn't have to think about scheduling, didn't have to worry about money, didn't have to write invoices, didn't have to log my own hours and stuff like that. Despite all of that, now that all of that work that I'm doing is going into something that I own and that I've built and that represents me, and that kind of puts my reputation in a little box, right, where I can present it. I think that is something that I wanted that I didn't know that I wanted. It was something that even at like a corporate job, even when I did design stuff in the office, I didn't feel that sense of gratitude, I suppose.
No, and you didn't own it either. I mean, you did it for the company. It was their property in a way. You can. And you said earlier on in our conversation that you didn't really have understanding of what Peter and I call practice was something that you have and own. You own what you've just described. It's in the box. It's your reputation and it's your prestige if eventually it achieves that, if that's your goal.
Yeah, and even the failure too is just like, even if it's a failure, even if it's a massive failure, the idea that it's my failure, I think, was something that I didn't realize I could value in this way. That it helped me value failure, I suppose, more, right, as a learning tool.
Absolutely. And in some ways, people stay in jobs and companies because they really dread failure, and this kind of buffers and insulates them, and it can become someone's other responsibility if something goes wrong. And we see now these trends of people what do they call it, doing the job but basically not doing the job.
Quiet quitting. Yeah,
all of that
quiet quitting, which is also, by the way, just like something that people have been doing forever, right?
Oh, I know.
Like, I'm always, these buzzwords kind of are a bit of pet peevish for me.
Well, it's kind of fun for us who can get a maybe a couple of headlines out of it.
It's good for a good hashtag.
Yeah, it throws us.
Helpful.
Quite a few. In my former world of academia, you basically would not ever want to be on a web page and have social media. That was too tacky. It was not professorial. So there's a few
MySpace days.
Yeah, the few of us were saying, "The hell with it! I want my thoughts to be known, and it's not going to be known if they're stuck between the pages of a journal." So a few of us would do what we call outside things, like consulting, but also just to have some fun, get some energy, and get some excitement around ideas. And now, if you look in my groups that I read through in LinkedIn and Facebook, I've got several much younger faculty who have, like Scott Allen has a really lively podcast. Bill Blendell, who is doing some really revolutionary work in our field organization change. However, he's got some graphics. He's got some graphic design going for him. It's stunning. And it's there on LinkedIn pretty much every day. So in what I call the new professor has to have a brand, I believe. Why? Because scratch it all down to the basis. We love to be noticed.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Why in the hell else would you want to be a teacher if you didn't want to be noticed? And once we're noticed, we want to have an engagement, and we want to have what Peter called co-inquiry. I'm eager to know what Nathan knows, and you probably have some interest in what I know. And
we have interest in what we know about each other too. I think it's
that goes back to the autobiography part, doesn't it? It basically says, I'm human and you're human. And let's probe our humanity a little bit too. And what that results in is a stronger feeling of trust, what my son Dave and Dad calls social bond. And that's something that I keep hearing over and over again. These days, people miss. They miss the chance to feel that closeness and have trusting relationships across which they can do new and better work. And you have given me that opportunity, Nathan Featherstone.
Oh, thank you. I trust you as well, I think.
Yeah, it's been great. So I'm going to close off our conversation for the podcast, and it will continue to do a little business. But it's been wonderful to get to know you better and get your
thanks for having me.
Perspective and on the book. I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, have me on again anytime.
Okay, I'm working my schedule up for 23. Thank you again. If you'd like to hear more, listen in on Spotify, Automatic, Apple Podcasts, or go to inactionresearch.com/podcasts-page. And if you'd like to learn more about social inaction and the nature of practice, head over to inactionresearch.com for more information. Thank you for supporting this show. We look forward to hearing from you soon.